Man watched the bell drop and the three words crawl across every screen, equity not found. Cameras flashed, confetti drifted in slow spirals, and Brad, the CEO, was smiling for the crowd like nothing had happened. I felt my phone buzz with missed calls, but I didn't move. My hands went to my laptop, and I opened 3 years of my life like a drawer I had finally decided to empty onto the table. For 3 years, I was the 3 a.m. guy, the one who fixed midnight outages, rewrote the backups when they broke, and glued the mess together with duct tape patches and coffee. People thanked me in hallways and then forgot the names of the fixes by Monday. Investors saw shiny slides about uptime percentages and growth curves, but they didn't see the commit logs. They didn't know who stayed up when the pager screamed. I watched the ticker drop and heard shouting through the TV speakers, the frantic pitches of men selling panic over the phone. The new engineers called 17 times. I let it go to voicemail. I clicked through commits like an old photo album. Each entry had my name, timestamps, and notes that read like confessions. Hotfix temp bypass, retry handler, add safeguard for edge case. Those safeguards were mine and they'd been there for years, quiet as a secret in the code. They weren't bombs. I never wanted to wreck anything permanently. I wanted attention and leverage. I wanted my work to be honored the way they honored the logo and the press releases. Those triggers were simple, disguised checks. A combination of rare conditions that would only flip if the system hit a specific, improbable state. I had buried them behind health checks and telemetry so nobody would stumble on them by accident. When the switches flipped, it wasn't elegant. It was messy, loud, and public. The front page of every client app returned that single humiliating phrase and investors watched billions evaporate in minutes. Phone calls became shouting matches. Brad pointed fingers on camera and called it sabotage. Reporters smelled a story and closed in. The new hires scrambled to reboot and patch, and in the background, lawyers started drafting letters. I felt the weight of 3 years of invisible labor sitting like a fist against my ribs while every anchor on TV repeated the charge. Hacker, sabotage, insider. I didn't want to be a villain on cable news. I wanted a reckoning. I wanted the board to understand that code isn't magic and that people do the dangerous, boring work that keeps those dashboards green. So I did what I always did when the pager went off. I documented everything. I exported commit histories, Slack threads, old notebooks that smelled faintly of coffee and cigarettes, timestamps that proved I was in the system legitimately. I didn't delete my work or hide it. I organized it like evidence and breathed through the anger that tried to make my hands shake. Conrad the lawyer told me to stop talking to the company directly and to preserve everything. He said the word criminal like a cold wind and made me feel smaller for a minute. You had access, he said, and that changes how the statutes read. Angelica, the reporter, called and asked for screenshots and logs. You think you broke them on purpose, she asked. I told her I forced a spotlight. I didn't try to burn the house down. She understood enough to push. She wrote the piece about promises made and promises broken, about contractors being promised equity like dessert that never showed up on the plate. After the article ran, calls started coming from people I hadn't talked to in years, former colleagues, contractors, and a few recruiters who asked the same question in different tones. Some were apologetic, some wanted to know if I'd burn my bridges for work. I wanted them to know it wasn't personal theater. It was leverage turned honest. Whitman and Associates sent a preservation notice and an 8-page letter accusing me of planning an attack, demanding devices, and threatening ruin. Their language was cold and legal and meant to scare. I read their demands and then I read my own commit logs again. The money they had promised as future, fuzzy equity had been a mirage that let them keep people working for free until a deadline. The new engineers had no idea who built the fallback systems because the old team had been let go in rounds and thanked with platitudes at parties. That neglect was technical debt piled so high it caught fire. I had been the guy who shoveled coal into that fire at 2 in the morning because someone had to. When the triggers tripped, the fire went out in a way that couldn't be missed. There was fear after that first night, of arrest, of ruin, of being the villain in a story I didn't fully control. There was also a strange, fierce relief. For the first time, the board had to answer questions in public about their tech claims. For the first time, investors demanded the commit histories and the truth. I was still the same man who'd patched systems at midnight. I still had the same hands that wrote the safeguards. But the silence around that labor had ended, and the company that built its narrative on invisible work was suddenly forced to reckon with what they'd built and what they'd promised. The envelope hit my doormat and my hands went cold before I even saw what was inside. Whitman and Associates had sent 50 pages that smelled like threat and paper, breach of contract, computer fraud, and a number floated like a guillotine, $62 million in alleged damages. The language was clinical and precise, but the intent was obvious. They wanted to intimidate me, bury me, and make everyone else too scared to listen. I called lawyers all day and learned how expensive fear was. Every firm I reached out to wanted a few thousand just to talk, like they were selling me a first-class ticket out of a sinking ship. I hung up on 3 voicemail messages that promised aggressive representation in voiceover tones. Conrad, the lawyer, finally came through. His assistant squeezed me into his schedule the next morning at 9, and I slept like a man who had enough adrenaline to stay awake until the sun rose. I spent the night printing everything I had. Slack logs, Git diffs, commit messages, spreadsheet exports, and notes where I'd tracked my hours. Nights that read like a calendar of sacrifice, 70 to 95-hour stretches of rebuilding backups and patching cascading failures while executives toasted investor wins at rooftop bars. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. I had an old spiral notebook with coffee rings and shorthand scribbles, retry loop fix 3M, added WatchGuard 212, and I scanned each page into PDFs. My printer ate all my ink twice and I made 3 trips to the all-night store, my shoes sticking to the parking lot from melted gum. The cashier half didn't ask why I was buying toner at 2 in the morning. The world narrowed to documents and timestamps. My apartment smelled like paper and bad coffee and the faint bleach from cleaning up after a panic attack. I arranged files into folders named for dates and broken systems. October 2019 hotfix, backup rewrite 2020 equity emails. Each file name was a breadcrumb. I didn't want to throw anything away that could show the pattern, promises of equity, then cold legalese and an empty cap table. I wanted the record to exist in pixels and paper so there'd be no mistaking what I'd done and why. Conrad arrived the next morning looking like he had a good night's sleep and no patience for theatrics. He sat at my kitchen table with a porcelain mug and scanned my printouts like a man reading autopsy notes. "You built pretty much everything that kept this thing from dying," he said, and it hit like relief and anger at once. He told me straight the dangers. Criminal charges were possible because I had authorization, but that also meant I had a paper trail that could show intent wasn't malicious. "We can argue civil, not criminal," he said, "but that depends on what you can show and how loud the press gets." Angelica called while we were unpacking the story. "People are going to want names and evidence," she said. "Do you have what you told me?" I told her yes, and then I recited commit hashes and timestamps until she said, "Send it." She wanted proof and she wanted stories from other contractors who had been promised equity and left holding nothing but memories. I started emailing former colleagues while Conrad told me not to delete anything and to preserve every device I touched. He used words that sounded like locks and safe harbors, preservation order, chain of custody, forensic image. He told me to expect an immediate reaction from their lawyers. They came with that reaction fast. Whitman and Associates demanded my devices, threatened lawsuits, and filed a preservation notice that felt like a net dropping around my neck. A courier delivered the letter and 3 lawyers' signatures at noon, and their message was clear: hand over everything and be quiet. I read their demand and then went back through my commit logs again like a man checking a wound for infection. Each line of code had a timestamp and a story. Each story had witnesses. I started compiling an index. Who knew what and when, and where to find the proof on servers and in messages. I called a few former coworkers in hushed tones. Some were afraid and didn't want to get involved. A couple were furious and said they would back me publicly. "They promised us equity like an afterthought," one of them said, voice shaking with the memory of a layoff text at 3 in the morning. I asked for screenshots and saved them into folders labeled by name and date. Every new message made the picture sharper. It wasn't one man's delusion, it was a pattern of behavior that repeated across teams and time. As the day ended, I realized the choice was no longer abstract. I could sign their settlement offer and take $50,000 to disappear, or I could fight and risk everything. Conrad set out a plan with the bluntness of someone who had seen men bet their lives on bad cards. "We document, we file whistleblower materials, and we make this about the broken promises," he said. "You did something dramatic enough to get attention. Now we use that attention." I stared at my printer's empty cartridge holder and thought about every night I'd spent rescuing their numbers. Fear still sat under my ribs, but under that was a tired, stubborn pride. I set an alarm to start another morning of work that wasn't about servers but about the paperwork of justice. My hands were steady enough to type commit hashes and to forward screenshots to Conrad and Angelica. The legal threats were meant to scare me into silence, but the more paper they sent, the more paper I gathered. The world had tried to fold my labor into silence. I was arranging it into an argument that nobody could ignore. I met Conrad, lawyer, in a cramped conference room, and he surprised me by being younger and sharper than I expected, and he cut straight to the risks. He sat across from me with a legal pad and a look that said he'd handled worse than threats on letterhead. "Civil suits will mess your life up," he said, tapping a pen against the pad. "But the federal computer statute can put you in prison if they prove intent and the damage crosses a threshold." His words sounded like a slow drop in a well. I felt my throat tighten and tried to breathe like the meeting had an oxygen meter attached to it. Conrad explained things plainly. The company would paint me as an insider who acted with malice, and if prosecutors bought that story, the penalties could be severe. He used phrases that stayed with me: unauthorized access, exceeding authorization, and damaging protected computers. He told me the law looks at outcomes as much as actions. If the market lost enough money and Brad, CEO, leaned on prosecutors, I could end up charged with a federal crime. I thought about my hands on a keyboard, about how those hands had saved systems at 3 in the morning, and how the same hands could now be framed as tools for a crime. "Stop touching their stuff," Conrad said flatly, and the sentence landed like an order I needed to obey. "No pings, no diagnostics, no logging into dashboards, don't even open emails that live in their system." That restriction felt like a confession and a surrender lumped together, but it was necessary. He explained the legal theory: any additional access could be spun as continued wrongdoing and would weaken our story. I pictured the internal tools I'd used 1,000 times, and felt a strange grief at walking away from them suddenly. The restriction was painful because my instinct was to fix things. Old habits die hard when you're the guy who answers 3 a.m. pages. I felt a twitch whenever my phone buzzed, a muscle memory that wanted to jump on the issue and make it better. Conrad gave me rules and a checklist: preserve evidence, photograph everything served to you, don't alter devices, and let him handle the legal contact. He said, "We're building a record that shows your actions were remedial and authorized, not malicious." Those words helped steady my hands and slowed my urge to tinker with the very systems at the center of the storm. While Conrad mapped legal danger, Angelica, reporter, became the public bridge I needed. TechCrunch wanted to verify my screenshots and my timeline, and Angelica didn't take anything at face value. We spent 3 hours on the phone going through message IDs, server timestamps, Slack exports, and Git commit hashes until she sounded satisfied the chain of custody was intact. "Send me the raw exports," she said. "Not screenshots, the originals." I learned to export metadata like a chef learns knife angles. I sent her logs with file names, checksums, and explanations of how the system recorded events. Explaining the technical chain of custody to a reporter forced clarity on me. I had to explain why a message ID proved a thing happened at a time, why server timestamps mattered, and how Slack's export showed who wrote what and when. I found myself saying, "Look, the logs tie the commits to me and show I had authorized access. The triggers were in the code for years, they were safeguards, not booby traps." Angelica would ask a pointed question, and I would answer plainly until she nodded and said, "Okay, I can run with this." Her taking the story seriously felt like a lifeline tied to a buoy in dark water. Between Conrad's blunt legalism and Angelica's steady fact-checking, I started to build a plan. Conrad drew an axis of risk and benefit on his pad and said we needed public pressure to push this toward civil remedies and away from criminal referrals. I knew public pressure could cut both ways, but the company had already nudged the narrative towards sabotage on TV. If we could show systemic promises and pattern of neglect, we could flip the frame to exploitation. That meant more documents, more witnesses, and a calm presentation of facts, not drama. I called former colleagues with careful words and asked for screenshots and messages that backed up my story. Some didn't want to be involved, others were angry enough to help without hesitation. Each new file I gathered tightened the weave of our case. Conrad told me to expect attacks on my motives and character and to be ready for that. I thought about the nights I'd spent patching systems and about how one loud mistake had dragged everything into daylight. The fear of prison was real, but so was the growing charge of purpose. The purpose to show a broken system for what it was and to stop letting work like mine be invisible and unpaid. I watched the piece go live and felt the room tilt like someone had shoved me off balance, and then the tide changed almost overnight. Angelica, reporter, laid out a clear pattern. Promises of equity that never showed up, contractors kept on for years without proper employment protections, and slides stuffed with numbers that didn't match the reality of who did the work. Her writing cut through the PR gloss and named the problem plainly. I sat at my kitchen table and read the article twice, then a third time, like reading a map that finally pointed to where I'd been walking blindfolded. After the piece ran, former colleagues started reaching out with messages that matched mine. One of them, an ex-employee engineer, sent a signed statement saying executives promised shares and then cut him loose right before anything vested. Another, a contractor DevOps, forwarded a screenshot of an exec joking in a chat about how easy it was to keep contractors working for free. Those messages had the bluntness of people who had been burned and were finally ready to show the burn marks to someone else. I copied everything into my folders and sent it to Conrad, lawyer, with file names that made sense and notes that explained context. The company reacted the way companies with something to hide usually react, with noise. Their PR called me a rogue contractor and accused me of cyberterrorism, words heavy enough to sink a man. The press release had polished sentences and a lawyer's cadence. LinkedIn became a battlefield, my inbox filled with hate messages and angry people who had seen the PR and assumed the worst. Recruiters who had been friendly a week before vanished like fog. A few firms that had been in talks paused their offers with quiet, cautious messages. It stung to see people I had trusted step back because the headline made them afraid. But Angelica's piece hit investors where it hurt. The stock dipped again and the board called an emergency meeting. That was the sound of power shifting toward questions. How could they have claimed such technical strength and left it all held together by duct tape and midnight people? The board had to answer for the mismatch between slides and reality. Suddenly, the company's narrative that I had sabotaged them didn't stick as cleanly because there were too many voices saying the same thing. Public pressure made the legal threat rings smaller in a way I couldn't have put into words. Whitman and Associates answered with more letters and a demand for devices, but now their emails landed in a world that had read Angelica's article. People started to ask tougher questions. A few of my former colleagues agreed to be named to reporters and to provide their messages. They were nervous, some of them had mortgages and kids, and they asked me if I would go public with their names only if they were sure. I promised to protect them where I could and to push for anonymity where needed. The moral weight of this wasn't abstract anymore. It was real people who would risk careers speaking out, and I didn't want to make them collateral. Conrad shifted strategy and said the piece had given us leverage we didn't have before. He talked about mediation and whistleblower filings, and about making the story a civil fight about labor and promises, not a criminal manhunt. The DA's office will hate bringing criminal charges where the facts suggest a dispute over employment and contracts, he said. That was a comfort and a reminder we had to keep building the civil record. We collected more documents, emails, and witness statements. Every new item narrowed the room for the company's narrative to breathe. There were ugly moments. I got angry messages and threats, people convinced by the PR machine that I had ruined thousands. I felt the sting, but I also felt something else, a shift toward truth. Investors wanted answers. The board wanted a scapegoat less than they wanted to stop the PR bleed. Brad, CEO, issued a statement that danced around responsibilities and accused rogue elements while denying culture problems. It read like damage control and not like remorse. I watched him on a panel later, smiling, and felt the old bitter recognition that people like him survive these storms and keep moving. By the end of that week, the public conversation had changed shape. It was no longer just about me triggering switches in the code. It was about a system that used promises as labor leverage and then tried to hide that leverage when the bill came due. The article had given other people the courage to speak up, and that collective voice made a corporate lie harder to maintain. I still had legal fights ahead and the threats were real, but the tide had shifted enough that my fight wasn't solitary anymore. I wasn't just defending myself. I was holding up the paperwork of 3 years of labor and saying, "This is what you paid me with, and it wasn't enough." Their offer arrived like a joke in an envelope, $50,000 and a complete NDA. It was meant to be a gag, the polite way of saying go away. I laughed at the table and snapped a photo of the page before I slid it across to Conrad, lawyer. He looked at it and didn't smile. "They want to buy silence," he said. "They want to make sure this never reappears in public." That made me more stubborn than scared. Buying me off would let them keep pretending nothing was broken. Conrad told me to draft a counter that actually reflected what they owed. I made a list in plain terms: unpaid overtime, back pay for years of after-hours work, reimbursement for legal fees, and a written promise of immunity from criminal referral if I cooperated on safe terms. He added a clause about a narrow release tied only to those conditions, not a global gag that would prevent the truth about systemic labor issues from escaping. "Don't sign a cheap silence," he said. "We want remedy, not hush money." His voice was steady, and it gave me confidence to put reasonable numbers and conditions into a document that could be shown at a table. We didn't stop there. Conrad filed a whistleblower complaint with the SEC. The complaint pointed to deck slides that bragged about an engineering headcount and technical muscle that didn't match reality. Those slides had helped bring in millions of investor dollars. The complaint said it plainly. They raised money on a story that left out the fact that a fragile codebase was being held together by a handful of contractors and one exhausted guy who patched things at 2 in the morning. The complaint included screenshots, commit logs, and side-by-side comparisons of the pitch deck claims and the actual team rosters. Filing that document changed the tenor of negotiations. I wasn't just a disgruntled contractor anymore. I became someone with a formal whistleblower path and protections if the SEC chose to act. That scared them in a way the lawsuits hadn't. Investors who had been quiet and worried began asking tougher questions. The board called for mediation and arranged a meeting in a high-rise conference room with glass walls that looked over a city that suddenly felt smaller and less safe for them. I packed boxes of printouts like a man gathering armor. Commit logs, Slack threads, emails, spreadsheets showing my hours and the promises I'd been given. I stacked them in crates and labeled them with the neatness of someone who'd always worked with timestamps. Walking into that conference room felt like walking back into every late-night emergency I'd fixed. The same adrenaline, the same need to make sure nothing caught on fire. The board sat across from me, faces careful and measured. Brad, CEO, sat quieter than usual, and a few engineers who had once avoided midnight pages looked like men seeing a mirror they preferred not to look into. Their outside counsel began with a practiced tone, offering platitudes about regret and miscommunications. They still wanted me to sign the NDA and take the $50,000. I set my boxes down and then I set mine of evidence on the table too. I watched their faces tighten when Conrad pulled out specific commit hashes and Slack messages showing promises that never materialized. "We can show who promised what and when," Conrad said, voice low enough to keep the room from feeling theatrical. "You asked my client to do work with promises. That exchange matters." The lawyers shifted in their chairs like a tide changing direction. Mediation is a slow thing. It is a lot of staring and small moves like chess. It felt different from the nights I had stayed up patching outages. This was about paper and positions. I explained plainly what I needed: back pay for unpaid overtime, coverage of legal fees, and a narrow immunity from criminal referral if I assisted in a supervised handoff. I told them I would help only under safe harbor to avoid the risk of prosecution for work I had done under authorization. That was the honest deal. I wanted repair, not revenge, and I wanted the truth preserved for others who might be promised the same phantom equity. They pushed back. Whitman and Associates argued numbers and painted my hours as exaggerated. Their outside counsel tried to cast my code as sabotage rather than safety nets. A few engineers muttered about edge cases and unexpected state transitions, as if that explained away years of missed payroll and vague equity promises. I listened, and then I spoke calmly about the nights in my old notebook where I'd written "no shares" next to a timestamp after a meeting. I did not shout. I did not plead. I laid down documents and let the paper tell the rest. By the end of the first day, the room had narrowed to a handful of real options. They could try to bury the story with money and gag orders and then hope investors would forget. Or they could accept a settlement that fixed my harms, paid legal costs, and included a supervised handoff so the company could stop bleeding technical debt. Conrad said the latter was cleaner and more realistic given the SEC notice. The board looked tired and small under the ceiling lights, and Brad's jaw had lost some of its earlier confidence. I felt a tired clarity settle in me. I wanted a future where my work mattered and where it wasn't traded for promises that never existed. That thought, more than any check or threat, had brought me into that room. I plugged in my laptop and didn't waste a second. The room went quiet as I clicked the first slide and handed the board their own words back on the screen. I opened the presentation and the first slide was a screenshot. Brad, CEO, dismissing my warning in a chat thread with a shrug emoji. The image landed in the room like a thrown stone, and the conference table trembled with new attention. Slide after slide came up and they couldn't look away. There were messages from the CFO bragging about how easily contractors could be leveraged to keep margins high, and investor decks that promised technical capacity far beyond what existed. I watched faces as the evidence piled up. Charts that overstated headcount, bullet points that claimed a mature engineering team, and commit logs showing a single name doing the midnight triage work. The board paled when Brad's messages admitting understaffing flashed across the screen, and someone at the far end of the table shifted their weight awkwardly. I spoke plainly to the room because Conrad, lawyer, had told me to keep it factual and tight. "These are timestamps and messages. These commits prove the work was done. These slides show what you sold," I said, and I felt the room tighten like a lung filling with air. Brad tried to look small and angry all at once. "That was just internal," he said, but the words sounded thin in the glass room. The evidence didn't care about PR spin, it only showed the truth of who had kept the systems alive. Negotiations moved like a slow grind, and their offers felt designed to blur the story. They wanted me to sign away public speech and to provide immediate technical help on demand. Conrad leaned in and said, "We can negotiate assistance, but with safe harbor and limits, no open-ended obligations." I pushed back because the last thing I wanted was to be pulled back into cleaning their mess without protection. I will help, but only if there is a written binding promise of no criminal referral and legal fees covered, I told them, and the table hummed with the seriousness of those conditions. They argued numbers like accountants on a razor. Their lawyers claimed 50,000 was generous, and their CFO muttered about market impacts if the settlement was large. I pushed for back pay for overtime, reasonable legal costs, and a sum that reflected 3 years of uncounted labor. You can't put 3 years of unpaid, after-hours work into a single line item and expect us to accept a token amount, I said, and the room listened because the paperwork on my laptop had already shown them the math they couldn't ignore. We went late into the afternoon and everyone grew tired of posture and theater. I kept returning to the hard facts, commit hashes, timestamps, and the signed statements we'd collected. Conrad moved like a chess player and peeled back their positions slowly, asking for narrow speech restrictions instead of a total gag, immunity from criminal referral, and 10 hours of supervised technical assistance so the handoff would be safe. The idea was to trade cooperation for protection, a clean fix with legal coverage. At one point, Brad barked, "You broke our launch," and his voice echoed like an accusation. I looked up and said, "I forced attention. I didn't burn the company down. I would have kept fixing things if anyone had honored the promises." That line didn't win everyone over, but it cut through the noise. The board member sighed and pushed a stack of papers toward their counsel, signaling a shift from pure defense to compromise. We sliced the elephant into pieces: money, speech, and assistance. They wanted speech limitations that would prevent me from leading a smear campaign. I insisted those limitations be narrow, related only to specifics we settled, and not broad enough to silence whistleblowing about systemic labor practice. We bargained the number until it became a practical middle ground and until the lawyers stopped pretending the fight could be won by bluster alone. By late afternoon, the signatures happened. We signed papers agreeing to a settlement worth several $100,000, not the insult they'd offered, but also not the full value of what I'd lost. The speech restrictions were narrow and specific, carefully worded to avoid gagging whistleblower rights. I agreed to 10 hours of supervised technical assistance under a clear safe harbor clause so nothing I showed could be used against me. Conrad and I had pushed hard enough to get protections that mattered. Walking out of that glass-walled room felt like both an ending and a beginning. The settlement bought me safety and a path to repair, but the weight of those printed commits and messages sat heavy in my arms. I had forced a reckoning that afternoon, and the company had to answer for promises it had made. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt resolved. I had traded silence for a chance to rebuild a life that didn't belong to midnight pages and unpaid labor, and I had protected others from the same quiet erasure. Spent 2 supervised days in a gray conference room with their engineers and felt every hour like a shift at the coal face of the system I'd kept breathing. I opened my laptop and walked them through what I had built and why it only ever looked stable by miracle and midnight work. I didn't lecture. I showed logs, configuration files, and the comments I had left years ago that read like notes to myself. Safety switch, do not remove, and timestamps that told the story better than any speech ever could. The room smelled like burnt coffee and tension, and I felt each person lean in as the code unrolled on the screen. I pointed out the backup systems layered on top of brittle foundations, the kind of duct tape architecture that works until it doesn't. I explained how retries masked latency and how 1,000 small band-aids had become the apparent uptime metrics on investor decks. I showed how error handlers were disguised as innocuous comments and why those comments mattered. They held conditional checks and silent fails that only triggered when the rare combo of events aligned. I made sure everyone saw the exact lines that flipped when the equity not found message went out so no one could pretend it was imagination or malice. The lead engineer, engineering lead, stared at the screen and admitted he had not grasped half of what was actually running the production environment. His voice was flat when he said it, like the relief of someone who'd been pedaling a bicycle without seeing the chain. Another engineer, quieter, apologized for ignoring my warnings when I'd sent messages about undocumented fallback behavior and missing staffing. That apology landed like both regret and recognition. A thing I had wanted since the first night I patched a backup at 3 a.m. Watching them finally understand was oddly vindicating and also exhausting because understanding alone didn't fix the debt that had built up. I walked them through safe ways to disable the triggers I had placed. Step-by-step checks, test harnesses to validate behavior, and a rollback plan for each change. I insisted on supervised handoffs and on commit messages that would make sense to anyone who opened the repository in the future. We paired on screens and ran dry runs until their systems no longer showed the hidden switches in fail mode. For the first time, the engineers who would be on call after I left could read the logs and know what to do without calling me at 2 a.m. The follow-up press coverage shifted in tone once the mediation and the handoff were public. Angelica Reporter wrote a piece that framed this as an endemic problem, not a single villain story. The headlines moved from sabotage and rogue contractor to pieces about startups that promise equity and leverage contract labor in ways that leave people exposed. Other contractors came forward with similar stories about promised shares that never vested and long stretches of unpaid, after-hours work. The conversation widened to labor practices and investor responsibility, instead of just a man at a keyboard. Brad CEO left quietly a few weeks later, the kind of exit that reads like a resignation letter and a door closing. The stock stabilized after a rough run. Investors and the board shifted focus to rebuilding credibility and to addressing the gaps the press had exposed. The company hired more staff and started documenting better, slowly patching the cultural cracks that had let a single person hold the whole thing together. I watched that happen like someone seeing scaffolding go up after a building nearly fell. The settlement closed and the money helped in practical ways. I paid legal bills, covered therapist sessions for workplace trauma, and moved into an apartment in a building with a doorman so I could sleep better. The harassment tapered off after the press cycle died down, and the firms that had paused their recruitment returned with reasonable offers once the legal fog cleared. My bank accounts got healthier and my nights stopped being ruled by server logs. Those changes were small and real, like replacing a cracked window pane and finally being able to lock the door. I kept copies of everything in a safety deposit box because habits die hard and because Conrad Lawyer told me to preserve the record for years. I took a steadier job with an engineering lead who respected work hours and paid promptly, and I set hard rules: no unpaid overtime, documented deliverables, and clear pay for emergency response. That structure felt like a cure after years of improvisation. I didn't celebrate so much as exhale. The fight had been ugly and costly, but it made room for other people to speak up without being crushed under legal threats. In the end, I was tired and not particularly triumphant. What felt right was this: the system couldn't quietly rely on invisible labor anymore. People who'd promised equity had to answer in ways they hadn't before. I got paid for some of what I'd lost, and I kept my voice narrow and honest, which was the only victory that felt like it mattered. I went home that night and slept without a pager in my pocket, and that small mercy felt huge. I moved out of the apartment that smelled like burned coffee and stress and into a place with a doorman and better locks. And the change felt like armor I'd finally been able to buy. I signed the lease with hands that had stopped shaking the way they used to, then hired a mover who didn't ask questions and took the boxes I'd packed with the care of someone carrying evidence. The new building had a hallway light that stayed on all night and an elevator that closed without drama. That small normalcy hit me like a relief I hadn't known I'd been starving for. I found a therapist who specialized in workplace trauma, and we started meeting every week because 3 years of nonstop crisis don't just evaporate with a settlement check. I said things out loud I'd only written in notebooks before. The nights my pager screamed, the way my hands learned to move faster than sleep, the guilt when I ignored a text because I was trying to eat or breathe. She taught me to name the panic and to practice small habits: breathing exercises, shutting the laptop at a set time, and making lunch away from the desk. "You did the right hard thing," she told me once, and hearing it from someone who didn't owe me anything felt like new currency. The job with Luca's lead started slow and steady, exactly how Conrad had recommended I approach the next chapter. Luca's respected boundaries and paid on schedule. He didn't praise midnight heroics, he punished them gently by enforcing time tracking and backup rotation. The work was routine: audits, API work, documentation, and it was boring in the best possible way. I refactored legacy endpoints, wrote clear README files, and set up proper monitoring so no one would need a ghost in the system at 2 a.m. One of the first things Lucas said was, "If you're on call, you get paid triple. No exceptions." That sentence felt like a promise I could count on. I kept everything from the fight stored the way Conrad insisted: originals in a safe deposit box at the bank and encrypted copies in a personal drive. The boxes held commit logs, Slack exports, lawyer letters, and the notebooks stained with coffee and notes written at stupid hours. We agreed to preserve everything for years, not because I wanted to relive it, but because records matter when a pattern repeats. "Paper keeps the truth stubborn," Conrad said, pulling a file and looking at me like he'd expected this would be useful again someday. I liked that he treated evidence like scaffolding for future protections. Angelica Reporter later won a journalism prize for the series and sent me a short message that said, "You did the hard part, thank you." That small recognition mattered in a way that cash did not. Seeing her name on the award list and knowing the series had changed how people talked about startup labor felt like a communal win. Other reporters reached out for follow-up pieces, and contractors who'd been silent before began sending messages asking what to do if they were promised equity. I answered patiently and told them what I wished someone had told me years ago. Demand written terms, get a lawyer before you trust a promise, and save your logs. Recruiters came back with thoughtful offers after the noise settled, and I started to be picky in a way I hadn't allowed myself before. I turned down anything that smelled like vague equity promises or we're all in this together culture without numbers attached. I said no to one job that wanted me to be on call and part of the family, and I said yes to another that paid clearly and offered paid emergency time. That clarity felt like a muscle I'd rebuilt. I could insist on conditions and still be employable. My phone stopped lighting up at 3 in the morning with crises, and the silence at night became a part of my sleep ritual rather than a threat. I still check the door twice sometimes when I leave, an old reflex that takes 2 seconds and saves me from a full panic. Those moments are small and manageable, like a hand on the wheel when you've driven a bad stretch of road and survived. The panic that used to be a constant hum has faded into a background I can ignore most days. The settlement helped in the practical ways it was supposed to. My bank account stopped breathing through a paper bag I paid for therapy, and I rebuilt a schedule that included meals and weekends. I don't glow with triumph, I glow with ordinary safety. The future looks quieter and mine to plan. I make lists now that aren't about patches or crisis playbooks. I write down vacations and dentist appointments and small goals that have nothing to do with saving systems at night. That quiet feels like recovery, and I guard it like the boxes in the bank. Wake up to silence, and it still surprises me how foreign it feels after years of midnight alarms and pager screams. The phone doesn't light up at 3 a.m. with chaos. It hums quietly with calendar reminders and a few Slack pings that arrive at 9 and not at 2. I roll out of bed without checking logs first, make coffee, and walk into work that is measured and ordinary in a way my body is still learning to accept. That ordinary life used to feel impossible, and now it is my new baseline. I log commits for Lucas, lead like clockwork, and I do it during business hours because Lucas respects the schedule he set. The work is steady, audits, API changes, documentation updates, and it fits into a day with lunch and a walk in time to cook dinner without a nagging dread. I invoice on the 15th and the last day of the month, and the payments land on time. I watch the bank balance without a stomach drop now. The settlement money gave me a buffer that stopped the daily scramble for cash and allowed me to breathe between paychecks. Those small certainties add up into something real, a life that is predictable in a healthy way and not just full of crisis. I mentor other contractors in the spare hours I used to use for panic fixes, teaching them what I wish someone had told me when I first started taking work that came with equity promises. I tell them plainly, get everything in writing, insist on documented pay, and refuse unpaid overtime unless there's a signed agreement that says otherwise. I walk them through how to export logs and save Slack threads, and to name their deliverables clearly so they aren't left holding vague promises. People listen because they see the scars on my schedule and the papers in my safe deposit box. It feels good to pass on practical knowledge instead of rage. My non-negotiables are simple and firm now. I demand documented pay terms before I start any work, clear run sheets for on-call duties with explicit compensation, and legal limits on after-hours requests. If a client talks about being part of the family without numbers, I say no. If a contract asks me to be always available without extra pay, I walk. Saying no is still uncomfortable sometimes, but each refusal strengthens the muscle I nearly lost during those years of saying yes to every midnight fire. The boundaries make hiring managers uncomfortable at first, but the right ones respect them and value the reliability that comes with a rested engineer. Therapy stuck to me like a plan and taught me how small rituals can keep panic from restarting. I learned to shut the laptop at a set time and to do 2 minutes of breathing whenever a work text arrives after hours. My therapist helped me map the triggers so I could interrupt them: a breath, a walk, a text back that sets expectations. It wasn't magic. It was habits and time and a willingness to be less useful and more human. The settlement made the therapist visits possible, and the buffer allowed me to take them seriously instead of squeezing them between emergency calls. I don't romanticize the drama anymore. I remember the nights I glued the system back together and the strange pride that came with being relied on. I still respect the craft of late-night debugging, but I no longer mistake that suffering for worth. Standing up cost me sleep, friends for a while, and a public reputation that took hits, but it gave me leverage and a path to safety that I didn't have when I was invisible. It also opened doors for other people to name what had happened to them. Those conversations have changed hiring talks and slowly, the language investors use about teams. I regret trusting Brad's CEO and the empty promises as much as I regret any bad hire or relationship. Those regrets are concrete and useful because they taught boundaries. I don't regret fighting back the way I did. The fight was noisy and ugly, yes, but it forced the company to show its books and its promises and made a private pattern public. When Angelica Reporter won her award and sent a short thank you note, it felt like a small seal on the truth we'd pulled into light. That validation doesn't heal everything, but it helps steady the record of what happened. Recruiters returned with offers and I turned down any role that smacked of vague equity or unpaid padding. I took jobs that paid for emergency time and that had clear escalation policies. That clarity lets me plan vacations now. I book time off without the old dread of a midnight message scuttling everything. Taking a week means my team covers the calls or money is paid for the on-call work. That structure feels grown-up and humane. Tonight my door is locked and the lights are off and my phone is buried under a book on the nightstand. I check the deadbolt once out of habit and then breathe. For the first time in years, the last thing on my mind before sleep isn't a log entry or a failed test. It's not triumph or jubilation, it's simple relief. The future is quieter and it's mine to plan. I have hours that belong to me again, and that quiet keeps me steady through whatever comes next. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.